The year is 1305, and London stirs awake to the usual chorus of clattering carts and hawkers calling out their wares. Yet on this August morning a darker sound begins to rise, the roar of thousands pressing into the streets, eager to witness a spectacle unlike any other. Their eyes are fixed, not on a thief or murderer, but on a man whose very name had shaken an empire, William Wallace, the Scottish knight who defied the English crown. What awaited him was not a swift execution, nor the romanticized martyrdom that Hollywood later painted, but a methodical descent into cruelty, designed to shatter both his body and the idea of freedom he embodied. This was no death, it was a carefully staged performance of terror. Today, we strip away the myths and step into the horrifying reality of Wallace's last hours, a truth far more terrifying than you imagine. To understand the sheer horror of William Wallace's final moments, we must first step back into the turbulent world that produced them, a medieval Scotland standing precariously between independence and submission, a land where the idea of nationhood was only beginning to take root, and where loyalty was determined less by patriotism and more by the brutal reality of survival. The late 13th and early 14th centuries were defined by an unending struggle for power in the British Isles, and Scotland found itself caught in the tightening grip of King Edward I of England, a monarch whose ruthlessness had already been proven in Wales, and against the Jewish population he expelled from his realm. For Edward, Scotland was not a sovereign land but a restless province that needed to be subdued, and the rise of Wallace represented not only defiance, but a dangerous spark capable of igniting rebellion on a national scale. Wallace himself did not emerge from the traditional circles of nobility that dominated medieval leadership. He was not born into vast estates or wrapped in titles, but instead belonged to the lower tier of landholding society, a man hardened by personal loss and sharpened by outrage at the injustices inflicted upon his people. His family suffered gravely under English occupation, and from that pain was born a relentless drive for resistance. When he raised his sword at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, he was not simply fighting as a soldier, but as a man channeling his grief and fury into something larger than himself. His victory there was electrifying, a demonstration that the seemingly invincible English heavy cavalry could be broken, and with that moment, Scotland's dream of independence began to appear less like a fantasy and more like a possibility worth bleeding for. But Edward I, remembered in history as Longshanks, was not a monarch who tolerated defiance in any form. He had built his reign on the systematic suppression of resistance, knowing well that rebellion was like fire, a blaze that could spread uncontrollably if not stamped out with merciless precision. For him, William Wallace's success was not merely a military setback, it was a personal humiliation and a political danger that could unravel years of conquest. Thus, the Scottish knight's triumph at Stirling was to be answered with overwhelming force, and his very existence was transformed into a problem that could only be solved through complete and utter destruction. By the year 1305, the political landscape had shifted dramatically. The majority of Scotland's noble class, calculating their chances of survival, had bent the knee to Edward's authority, finding submission preferable to annihilation. Wallace's continued defiance, however, placed him not only in conflict with the English crown, but also in opposition to many of his own countrymen. His refusal to yield made him both a symbol of resistance and an inconvenient reminder to the Scottish aristocracy of their own compromises. To the English, capturing Wallace became essential to securing control over the northern kingdom. To many Scots of power, his downfall was a necessary evil that would allow them to preserve their fragile positions under English rule. The hunt for Wallace stretched across years, weaving through Scotland's hills and forests, sustained by a network of English spies, local informants, and collaborators whose motives ranged from fear to greed. With every passing season, the net around him grew tighter, as allies dwindled and safe havens became impossible to find. Betrayal, as is often the fate of legendary rebels, finally delivered him into the hands of his enemies. In August 1305, Wallace was captured near Glasgow, and though historians debate the precise details, it is widely believed that the betrayal came through a Scottish knight who had already submitted to Edward's authority. The betrayal was a cruel irony, the symbol of Scottish defiance undone not by English steel alone, but by the treachery of his own countrymen, and it marked the beginning of a descent into suffering more terrifying than anyone could imagine. The moment Wallace fell into English hands, the machinery of humiliation was set in motion. His capture was celebrated in London as a triumph of justice, yet for Edward this was only the opening act of a performance that would culminate in a punishment designed not just to end a man's life, but to obliterate his legend. From the very start, every step of Wallace's journey from Scotland to the English capital was orchestrated as psychological torture, a deliberate attempt to strip him of dignity before his body ever touched the scaffold. Dragged across towns and villages, displayed as a captured beast rather than a knight, Wallace was paraded through jeering crowds whose laughter and insults were encouraged by officials eager to degrade the figure who had once inspired fear across England's northern frontier. This slow march was not just about transportation, it was the first stage of execution, the erosion of spirit before the body was broken, and the grim preview of the horrors that awaited him on the cobblestones of London. When Wallace finally reached London after weeks of degradation, his torment was far from complete. For Edward I understood that the spectacle of justice could be as powerful a weapon as any sword, and thus the stage was set for a trial that was less a legal proceeding and more a calculated performance of state power. Westminster Hall, vast and echoing with the weight of royal authority, became the theater in which Wallace was to be transformed from a living man into an emblem of treason, and every detail of the event was meticulously designed to reinforce English dominance. The trial itself was conducted in Latin, a language Wallace almost certainly did not understand, a deliberate choice that underscored both his alienation from the process and the futility of any defense he might attempt. He was charged with treason, murder, sacrilege, and arson. Accusations broad enough to cover every act of rebellion he had committed against the English, and severe enough to justify the most terrifying punishment medieval justice could devise. The irony of the charge of treason did not go unnoticed by either contemporary observers or later historians, for Wallace had never sworn allegiance to Edward, and thus, in his own words, could not possibly betray a king he had never recognized. This defiant declaration, remembered in chronicles and repeated across generations, did nothing to alter his fate, but instead ensured that he would meet his death with the same unyielding spirit that had guided his rebellion. The judges, hand-picked by Edward himself, had no interest in fairness or mercy, and the verdict had been predetermined long before Wallace stood in chains before them. The trial, therefore, served only one purpose: to provide a thin veneer of legality to a punishment that was, in truth, political theater designed to terrify the Scottish people into obedience. The sentence, when it was pronounced, was not a simple order of execution, but a script of ritualized cruelty, each stage carrying symbolic weight meant to obliterate Wallace's dignity in life and reduce his memory in death. He was to be drawn through the streets of London, dragged behind horses as if he were nothing more than a carcass to be discarded. He was to be hanged by the neck, but cut down before death could grant him mercy. He was to be disemboweled and mutilated while still conscious, his organs burned before his eyes as a symbolic erasure of his humanity, and finally he was to be beheaded and quartered, his body fragmented and scattered so that no grave might serve as a rallying point for rebellion. In this ritual of destruction, Edward was making a statement that went far beyond one man, declaring to the entire kingdom that resistance was not merely futile but punishable, with horrors so complete that even memory itself might tremble. It is important to understand that such punishments were not uncommon in medieval England, for hanging, drawing, and quartering had long been the sentence reserved for traitors. Yet what set Wallace's case apart was the extraordinary care with which it was staged and documented, transforming his death into an international display of English power. Contemporary records reveal that the authorities prepared for the event with the precision of an army planning a campaign. Routes were mapped for the procession, scaffolds were constructed to ensure visibility, and scribes were appointed to record every detail so that the spectacle could be retold across generations. This was not justice, but propaganda, a deliberate act of psychological warfare meant to echo not only across Scotland, but across Europe, warning allies and enemies alike of what awaited those who dared to challenge the might of the English crown. Yet for all the intended humiliation, Wallace's defiance in the face of certain death gave the proceedings a haunting quality that Edward could not have foreseen. Chroniclers record that he refused to beg for mercy or renounce his cause, instead carrying himself with a grim resolve that unsettled even those who had gathered to mock him. The paradox of his trial was that the very cruelty meant to erase him from memory instead immortalized him, for though the English authorities succeeded in condemning his body to unimaginable torment, they also ensured that his death would be remembered in excruciating detail. In this sense, the trial and sentence became a double-edged sword, silencing the man but giving eternal voice to the martyr. Thus, with judgment pronounced, London prepared itself for the dreadful spectacle to come. Vendors flocked to the city in anticipation of the crowds. Scaffolds were raised to give spectators a clearer view, and common people traveled from miles around to witness what was advertised as both punishment and entertainment. The English crown had succeeded in turning the destruction of a single rebel into a festival of power, but in doing so, they planted the seeds of a legend that no executioner's knife could ever fully sever. The stage was ready, the actors assembled, and the curtain was about to rise on one of the most terrifying executions in recorded history. An event that would mark not just the end of a man, but the beginning of a myth that continues to echo through the centuries. The morning of August 23, 1305, dawned with a deceptive serenity. The warm sunlight glinting off the stone towers of London and the cobblestones alive with the bustle of anticipation. Yet beneath this ordinary summer sky, the city had been transformed into a stage for cruelty, its people summoned to witness not simply a death, but the deliberate unraveling of a man who had once defied an empire. Long before Wallace was dragged from his cell, crowds had already begun to gather along the carefully chosen route that would carry him from the Tower of London to the execution ground at Smithfield. The authorities understood that humiliation was most effective when shared by as many eyes as possible, and so the procession was designed to wind through the busiest districts of the city, ensuring that every craftsman, merchant, and beggar could bear witness to the final destruction of Scotland's most infamous rebel. Vendors sold pies and ale to the gathering masses, children perched on rooftops for a better view, and the atmosphere was charged with a grotesque carnival energy. For in medieval society, executions were not private reckonings, but public spectacles meant to both terrify and entertain. Wallace was bound to a wooden hurdle, a crude frame dragged behind horses, his body jolting and grinding against the cobblestones as he was pulled through the streets. The rough stones tore at his flesh, leaving streaks of blood in his wake. Each jolt of the cart, a reminder that his suffering was not to be swift but drawn out, a slow disintegration of both body and dignity. The crowds jeered and spat, hurling refuse and insults as he passed, their cruelty encouraged by officials who wanted the spectacle to be etched into the collective imagination as both warning and celebration. For the common people of London, the event was a holiday, a chance to indulge in bloodlust sanctioned by the state. For Edward I, it was the culmination of years of political strategy, a chance to demonstrate before thousands the invincible authority of the English crown. Yet within this sea of laughter and hatred, Wallace's silence spoke louder than any outcry. Contemporary accounts suggest he endured the ordeal with eyes fixed on some distant horizon, as if refusing to grant his captors the satisfaction of a scream. Whether it was defiance, shock, or resignation remains uncertain. But the effect was undeniable. Even as his body was dragged like an animal's carcass, he carried himself with a dignity that no rope or chain could entirely strip away. What made the procession so chilling was not only its physical brutality, but its psychological precision, for it was orchestrated to transform a once feared leader into a living emblem of humiliation. The sight of Wallace, battered, bloodied, and helpless, was meant to burn into the minds of every spectator the futility of rebellion. The dragging through London was a prelude, a narrative written on his body before the true horrors of the scaffold began, and the symbolism of this slow journey was as important as the execution itself. Each street he passed through, each district that echoed with the laughter of the mob, became a stage in the theater of state power. For Edward, this was a ritual of dominance, turning the most defiant figure of Scottish resistance into a grotesque procession of shame. The humiliation was carefully layered, first in the dragging, then in the spectacle of the jeering mob, and soon in the calculated agony of the scaffold. Yet even in this grim parade, the seeds of legend were being sown. Witnesses later wrote of Wallace's composure, noting how he refused to cry out or beg for relief, a detail that would echo in Scottish memory long after his body was destroyed. The English crown sought to erase him, to reduce him to a mangled warning, but the very extremity of the cruelty ensured that his image would be remembered not as a broken man, but as a martyr who endured degradation without surrender. The more the executioners strove to dehumanize him, the more enduringly human he became in the eyes of those who later told his story. By the time the procession reached Smithfield, the air had grown thick with anticipation, the scaffold looming above the crowd like a grim monument to power. Thousands pressed forward, eager to see the climactic act of the performance, their voices rising in a deafening roar as Wallace was hauled up onto the platform. The jeers, the laughter, the carnival spirit masked the deeper truth, that this was less about punishing one man than about imprinting terror on an entire nation. The dragging had broken his body, but it had not broken the symbol he had become, and as he stood at the threshold of unimaginable torment, the line between execution and legend began to blur. For Wallace, the long journey through London was over. The darker descent was only about to begin. At Smithfield, the crowd had already swelled to thousands, their noise echoing through the square like a storm of voices, each person straining for a glimpse of the man who had defied England's king. The scaffold, built tall and imposing, rose above the masses like a grim altar where ritual slaughter was about to unfold. Vendors shouted, selling bread, ale, and roasted meats, the carnival-like atmosphere clashing grotesquely with the horror about to begin. To the authorities, this juxtaposition was deliberate, for the execution was not merely a punishment, but a spectacle, an entertainment dressed as justice, a demonstration of what awaited anyone who dared to resist Edward's rule. When Wallace was hauled onto the platform, bound and stripped to the waist, the jeers grew louder, and yet amid the chaos he stood silent, his eyes still carrying that distant, unfathomable gaze, as if he saw something beyond the moment, something his tormentors could never touch. The executioner stepped forward, a man practiced in cruelty, his task not to grant death but to stretch it, to carve agony into minutes and hours so that the victim's body might become a living sermon of fear. The first act was hanging, but not the swift drop that broke a neck and granted release. Instead, the rope was knotted to strangle slowly, tightening around Wallace's throat as he kicked and convulsed, the color draining from his face as the crowd roared in delight at the universal dance of suffocation. Just as unconsciousness threatened to claim him, the rope was cut, and Wallace's body collapsed in a heap, still alive, still aware, dragged back from the brink so that his torment could continue. This denial of death was the essence of medieval cruelty, the prolonging of suffering, the refusal to allow the victim the mercy of silence or rest. Then began the act most feared and most grotesque, the disembowelment. With calculated precision, the executioner drove his knife into Wallace's abdomen, splitting it open while the man still breathed, still felt, still saw. Witnesses described the screams that followed as unlike any sound known to humanity, a raw cry that seemed to rise from the very depths of the soul. One by one, the organs were removed, lifted high for the crowd to see, and then tossed into a waiting fire so that the smell of burning flesh mingled with the summer air. In medieval thought, the bowels were believed to house compassion and emotion, and by burning them before his eyes, the executioners were symbolically destroying Wallace's humanity, reducing him to a spectacle of pain rather than a man of principle. It was not enough to kill him. He had to be unmade piece by piece, his body turned into a message of terror for all who looked upon it. Throughout this torment, some accounts claim, Wallace remained conscious, his eyes open and his spirit unbroken even as his body was systematically dismantled. Whether he spoke or prayed is uncertain, for the words have been lost to history, but the silence of surrender never came. This endurance, remembered in both English chronicles and Scottish legend, gave the moment a paradoxical quality, for while the crowd saw a man stripped of everything, they also saw a man who refused to yield even when stripped of life itself. Edward's goal had been to annihilate Wallace's dignity, yet in the very extremity of the cruelty, that dignity was magnified, etched into memory in ways no simple death could have achieved. Finally, when his suffering could no longer be prolonged, the executioner raised the axe and severed Wallace's head with a single stroke, ending his agony in an instant. Blood poured across the scaffold, and the head was held aloft to the roaring crowd, its grim display marking the culmination of the ritual. Yet even then, the cruelty did not cease, for his body was cut into 4 quarters, each limb hacked away and held up like butcher's meat before being dispatched to distant towns across England and Scotland. His head, dipped in tar to preserve it, was fixed on a spike atop London Bridge, a grisly trophy meant to glare down upon all who entered the city, while his limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, each fragment of flesh a warning nailed into the heart of Scotland itself. This dispersal was not random, it was deliberate political communication, a way to ensure that every corner of the kingdom saw the proof of Edward's victory and the price of resistance. Thus ended the life of William Wallace, not with a soldier's death on the battlefield, but with a nightmarish theater of cruelty that stripped his body while inadvertently clothing his name in immortality. The scaffold at Smithfield had been intended as a place of erasure, a stage upon which Wallace would be humiliated, broken, and forgotten. Yet instead it became the birthplace of legend, for in enduring the full measure of human cruelty without surrender, Wallace achieved the martyrdom that Edward had sought to deny him. The execution was over, but its echoes were only beginning, reverberating through Scotland, through Europe, and through the centuries to come. The blood-soaked scaffold at Smithfield may have claimed Wallace's body, but it could not silence the echoes of his defiance. For the aftermath of his execution revealed a paradox that Edward I had not anticipated. In seeking to annihilate Wallace's legacy through a spectacle of unmatched cruelty, the English crown had instead transformed him into a martyr, whose death inspired not only Scotland, but all who longed for freedom across Europe. The gruesome details of his disembowelment and quartering spread swiftly, carried in chronicles, whispered in taverns, and etched into the hearts of a people who now saw in Wallace not a defeated rebel, but a man who embodied the unbroken spirit of resistance. The very horror intended to crush Scotland's will to fight became the spark that reignited it, and from the ashes of one man's torment rose a legend that would endure for centuries. In the immediate political context, Wallace's death appeared to achieve Edward's aim, for Scottish nobles who had already bent the knee saw confirmation that resistance was futile, and many who had once flirted with rebellion now chose silence and submission rather than risk the scaffold's horrors. Yet this apparent victory was fleeting, for among those who witnessed the fate of Wallace with dread also stood figures who would later lead Scotland to renewed defiance. Robert the Bruce, destined to become King of Scots, is believed to have drawn inspiration from the brutality of Wallace's death, recognizing in it the ruthless reality of English domination and the necessity of continuing the struggle. For many Scots, Wallace's execution was not a deterrent but a revelation, exposing the true nature of the enemy and reminding them that surrender offered not peace but humiliation. The message Edward thought he was sending, that rebellion would lead to unimaginable torment, was inverted, becoming instead a rallying cry for desperate resistance. The symbolic aftermath extended far beyond the borders of Scotland. Across Europe, where rulers watched the contest between Edward and his northern subjects with interest, the account of Wallace's execution painted England not merely as a powerful kingdom, but as a cruel and merciless one. The calculated barbarity of hanging, drawing, and quartering revealed a state willing to weaponize justice into terror, and this reputation complicated England's diplomacy in the years to come. What had been intended as a show of strength became also a stain on England's image, a reminder that domination achieved through cruelty could never purchase loyalty, only fear, and fear was always temporary. In this way, Wallace's death echoed not only in Scotland's mountains and glens, but in the courts of Europe, shaping perceptions of Edward's reign in ways he had not foreseen. Culturally, Wallace's martyrdom became one of the foundational myths of Scottish national identity. Ballads and chronicles retold his story, sometimes with embellishment, sometimes with reverence, but always with the emphasis on his courage and his suffering. Over time, his image grew larger than life, no longer confined to the historical knight who fought at Stirling but transformed into the very embodiment of Scotland's struggle for liberty. The brutality of his execution gave his legend a power that victory on the battlefield alone might never have achieved, for it demonstrated that dignity could endure even when flesh was destroyed, and that principle could outlive the body. In the centuries that followed, Wallace's story inspired not only rebellion, but a cultural memory of endurance, teaching each new generation that freedom demanded sacrifice, and that some causes were worth the ultimate price. The lessons of his death continue to resonate even in the modern age, for Wallace's execution is more than a medieval atrocity locked in the past. It is a reminder of how authority can twist justice into cruelty, how power can disguise vengeance as law, and how easily the machinery of civilization can become a stage for barbarism when fear and control are at stake. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the capacity of ordinary crowds to cheer the suffering of others, and about the fragility of justice when wielded as a weapon of the state. Yet it also reveals the resilience of the human spirit, showing that even amid degradation and agony, dignity can survive, and that the memory of defiance can inspire far longer than the rule of any king. So as we look back upon the cobblestones of London, still echoing in imagination with the screams and silence of William Wallace, we find not only a tale of medieval cruelty, but a lesson etched into history, that freedom is never granted, only won, and that the price of liberty is often paid in suffering beyond measure. Wallace's body was torn apart, his head mounted on a bridge, his limbs scattered across towns as warnings. Yet his spirit defied the scaffold, living on to inspire a nation and shape the identity of a people. His execution, meant to be the end, became instead the beginning of legend. And if this glimpse into one of history's darkest spectacles moved you, remember that stories like these, stories of courage, cruelty, power, and resistance, remind us not only of the past, but of the struggles still shaping the present. So, if you found value in uncovering this truth hidden behind centuries of myth, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it, so that the legacy of William Wallace and the lessons drawn from his sacrifice continue to reach others who seek to understand the terrifying price of freedom.